Hello and welcome to the third in this series of IUCN Red List webinars. Please note that these webinars are being recorded and they will later be posted on the IUCN Red List website for anyone to see. So just note that we are recording at the moment. My name is Caroline Pollock. I'm the Senior Programme Coordinator for the IUCN Red List Unit based in Cambridge in the UK. And the main role of the IUCN Red List Unit is to manage and update the IUCN Red List of threatened species. And part of that role means we have to provide training, guidance and support for all of the people in the network of SSC members who are involved in IUCN Red List assessments. We completely understand that you spend a lot of time and effort in the Red List process, and we want to make sure we help you to do it right so you don't have to keep repeating things over and over again. So the purpose of these webinars is to provide you as assessors with the practical advice and support that you need to make the process more efficient and easier on everyone. So in today's webinar, we're going to focus on the data management system that we use to store, edit and submit all assessments for publication on the IUCN Red List. So this is the Species Information Service, or SIS for short. Note that we will not be discussing anything about the Red List criteria today. We will not be discussing the parameters used, like area of occupancy or extent of occurrence. We won't be talking about mapping. We're purely focusing on the data management system itself and how to use it. So please, when you ask your questions, try to focus on SIS and not on the criteria. There are other webinars and other guidelines and resources to help with those other topics, and I can guide you to them. Or you can ask the Red List website, the Red List unit directly, not a problem. But today we're talking about SIS. This is a very informal webinar. You're welcome to post your comments in the Q&A function. If you put your cursor to the bottom of the screen, you will see a little Q&A tool. If you click on that and write your comments and questions in there, I will be on hand throughout the webinar to answer those questions as we go along. And you will also get an opportunity to hear your questions being answered live from our speakers today. Speaking of which, our speakers today are Craig Hilton-Taylor, the manager of the IUCN Red List Unit, and Janet Scott, Programme Officer within the Red List Unit as well. We are really privileged to have both Janet and Craig talking today because we are super busy at the moment, actually working on the last Red List update of the year. So very privileged to have their time today. So without further delay, I will hand over to Craig.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and hello to everybody. So what I'm going to do in my short session now is we're going to dive straight into the data management system, SIS, as Caroline said. So let me just share my screen. So I'm not going to explain how to navigate around the system or various functions in the system. What we're very much going to focus on today is what happens at these Taxon landing pages, if you want to call it that, and then the assessments that hang off those pages. So SIS, essentially the backbone of SIS is a taxonomic hierarchy. And so there we can see the taxonomic hierarchy going from the kingdom right down to the species level, which is the page we're on currently. So every single one of these levels has a Taxon homepage, and various details hang off those homepages. So this whole taxonomic hierarchy is populated by the Red List unit. So when people are wanting to assess species that they're not already in the system, they ask the Red List unit to add the taxonomy to the system for them. So once you have your species in the system, you can then start doing assessments for it. And it's essentially from this level downwards that's of interest to all of you people out there, because this is the level where we hang the assessments from, whether they're Red List assessments, green status assessments, use and trade assessments, or even the Red List index information. So those appear on different tabs across this assessments tab here. Now, as I said at the start, it's the Red List unit that adds the taxonomy, but the system is large and has been running for many, many years. So we're dealing with lots of legacy data. And so it's very much your responsibility to check the names of the species and the authorities that are in the system, are they correct or not? If they're not correct, please let us know that whatever is incorrect with that. So you can't change any of that yourself, but there are lots of attributes on the Taxon homepage that you can edit. So you can edit synonyms, you can edit common names here on the right. You can add the taxonomic source for this concept of the species that you are going to be assessing. You can add taxonomic notes. You can add photographs. So this is what I'm going to delve into in these next few minutes. So essentially with this species here, Albula oligolepis, you can see the authority there. Note with the authority names, we use an ampersand, not an and we have a comma at the end of the authority string before the date. For animals. For plants, we don't have the date. We just have the string of the author names. One of the key things we like to have in the system is what taxonomic source are we using for this particular fish species? So when we look here at the taxonomic sources, okay, which source is being used for this taxonomic concept that is going to be assessed? And if we see here, there are 3 references. Immediately, you think, well, what's going on there? Why are there 3 different sources used? And then you realize, looking across here at the taxonomic notes, those same 3 references appear here in the taxonomic notes. So in fact, these are not the taxonomic sources. These are various papers dealing with the nomenclature and taxonomy. A much better taxonomic source here would be Eschmeyer's Catalogue of Fishes, which is our standard reference for fish species. So that's really what should appear here. And those 3 references there should be attached to this particular field, the taxonomic notes field. So if I open up the taxonomic notes field, you just make it slightly larger. In the top right-hand corner is a cogwheel, and there's a references section. That is where those 3 references should have been added, not outside the assessment. The reason why I'm stressing that is that by attaching the references here, what happens when you do your assessment, let's close that again. So you're working on your draft assessment over here, you're ready to submit it for publication, you submit it, it comes to the Red List Unit. When we process it, we check all the information here, we check the information in the assessment, and when we finally click the publish button, the SI system takes whatever is in the taxonomic notes at that point and the references that are attached to that cogwheel and adds them into the assessment, so it then gets fixed in time within that published assessment. So it means at any time you can change these taxonomic notes, but they will not change on the website until they get pulled into an assessment that has been submitted for publication through the publications process. So adding the references out here is really not helpful because they won't go into the assessment. They won't be linked to the assessment properly. So it's a really key thing to note. Moving to a different fish species. Sorry, one. In this case, still on the taxonomic source, the people have added Allen and Maclay, 1877. That is the publication where this species was originally described. But it's not the current taxonomic source that we're using for this taxonomic concept. Once again, it should be Eschmeyer's Catalogue of Fishes. So we don't want the original description. The only time we include publications with the original description is when it's a very newly described species and doesn't yet appear in any of the global catalogues that are mostly used as our taxonomic sources. So Handbook of Mammals of the World, Amphibian Species of the World, Reptile Database, and so on. Often new species are described. It takes a while before they appear in those global sources. So then in those cases, you then attach the taxonomic reference. Or it may be that we are deviating from one of those global systems, in which case you would attach a reference here to show why it is that we are deviating from Catalogue of Fishes, for example. But a paper back from 1877 is certainly not the concept that we might be following now. Turning to a different field that you can edit, these are the synonyms over here. You see the 3 different synonyms that have been added. And immediately when looking at that, you can see some odd things here. Some of them are in italics, some of them are not. And that's because the person who added these synonyms, decided to put in the HTML codes around those synonyms. Please do not do that. That should not be in there. When we pull those synonyms to the website, they are automatically turned into italics based on the rules for doing so. Don't do it here. We are looking at ways of changing this in SIS so it is more evident that those are in italics and don't need codes added to them. For the synonyms, we also don't want a long list of every single synonym for every taxon. What we're interested in is if the name here is in brackets, if the authority name is in brackets, what was the original combination for this name? The protonym, or in case of plants, the basionym. Are there other widely used synonyms that are used around the world today that might confuse people? Add those in. Has the species been listed under a different name on the red list previously? Those would be here, even including spelling errors. Are they used in other national red lists under different names? So those are the kinds of synonyms. It's not an extensive synonymy. That's not the role of the red list. That's the role of the taxonomic source that you would specify there to capture all the detailed synonyms. The other section you can edit is the common names. So you can add in any common names you want in any language. And we always ask that you try and indicate the preferred primary common name. And you can do that through the taxonomic tools, and you just set whichever name you want to be as the primary common name. For the first time you start adding common names, the very first name you add will be the primary name. You can then change it afterwards to being a different name if you want to. The other thing you can add is a photograph. So on the left-hand side, if there's no photograph, if you have a picture, you can easily attach an image. You just navigate to wherever your photographs are, and you can then attach it. Like that. Click on the picture, edit details. And this is where you need to add in whose photograph is it, who maintains the copyright permission. So this is John or Jack Randall's photograph. He provides a lot of photographs to the red list, and he's quite happy to have it used wherever we want. If you tick all those boxes, including the media box, if we do want to use your photograph or whoever provided the photograph for media purposes, we will get back to you to put in a more detailed media form, so we know exactly how you want your photograph to be used and attributed in the media. This includes social media, IUCN media releases, and so on. You save that, and now your photograph appears there with those details. And you can add as many photographs as you want. No limit on that. And they can be high resolution photographs. When they go to the website, they get reduced down in size, so they're no longer the high res photographs. Moving on to a different section. Find the species.
Craig, just briefly before you do move on, there's one question that I have answered in the Q&A section, but Aidan Atoli asks, is a list of the taxonomic catalogues, is that actually available on the website?
No, it isn't, sorry. It's a job that I have been meaning to do for some time, to put up a list. It's just such a changing, it changes so frequently, different sources, particularly for the plant world, as to which catalogs are used. But that is a page that will be coming onto the Red List website in due course to explain what are the main sources that we use for our taxonomy and where we have deviations. So apologies for that, it's not there at the moment. We used to have it, got lost in the website upgrade, and we haven't recreated that page, but it will be coming in the next year or so.
Thank you.
In the next 6 months or so. Thank you for that question. Going back to the synonyms again. So as I said, it's good if the name's in brackets to record the basionym. So in this case, they've ticked basionym, but it's a basionym for Central Notus Vidigo. And you look at it and think, well, why have they done that? And you realize, well, hang on, because they've got this other synonym, Campogramma Vidigo, which is in brackets. So they've added the basionym for that, not the basionym for this. We don't want to know about other basionyms, we only want to know the basionym for this one. So in fact, in this case, it's Scomber EMEA. That should have been the Bayesian, not where the close, that one, not that one. So now we have the correct Bayesian added. But as soon as we see these add functions here, we know that there's something odd here. We always look at that carefully. You can see here there are no commas between the names and the dates. If you look at all of them, you can see they've used an ampersand here, they've used an and there. So these are common mistakes that people do in adding lots of synonyms. They don't think about how they're adding them carefully, and so that then requires the Red List Unit to go through each one of these to edit them all so they are correct. So it saves us a lot of time if they are added correctly the first time around. You'll also see that some of these names, so Hypocanthus amia is obviously an alternative name for Lichia amia, but the authors are different. Here it's Smith, Vanners, and Steiger, whose the original name is from Linnaeus. So what they've done here, these authors changed the name of the genus, and when they added the synonym here, they've added their names rather than Linnaeus. So that's what's called a cresonym. And we really don't want cresonyms added to SIS where possible. But I know some of our Red List partners do like to have cresonyms because it's important for the work that they're doing. So, for example, a lot of the birds will have cresonyms added. So in this case, this kingfisher has 2 cresonyms added, but that format, they've said to begin with, they've put in subspecies, and those are not correctly formatted because they've put each species, subspecies, just on the 2 lines, whereas they should have actually used that drop down to actually enter this the subspecies name correctly. And the publication they're following where that name was used in there, but it hasn't been indicated correctly. So a better way of doing it is like this. So here you see the subspecies are shown properly, so you can see that there are subspecies. You can see the original author for each subspecies and the source where that name was used. So those are cresonyms that are properly integrated. And ideally, those references should then appear in the assessment itself as well, if you want to do that. But we highly recommend that people do not record all those cresonyms. They're not really that useful for us. Lastly, on this page, I just want to go to one particular situation that you will see. So this Heliconia, species of plant, Gaboriana, was assessed back in 2004. Heliconia latana was also assessed in 2004. These are both Ecuadorian endemics. What's happened now is that latana has been sunk as a synonym of Gaboriana. So if we want to reassess Gaboriana, we can't just add a new assessment here because the taxonomic concept has changed, it's been broadened out. So what we do is add a new concept to SIS. So we have to have _new add to there because we can't have 2 accepted names in the system at the same time. So this has a published assessment on the Red List website. If we drop this name, the assessment would drop off the website and users won't know what's happened to it. So we have to temporarily just use this _new. Somebody goes in, does the assessment. Once they submit that for publication, we will drop this old concept from the market as not accepted, not recognized. We will change the name of this, take off the _new, merge in latana as a synonym, and then it'll be ready to be published on the website. So if you see the _new, that is what that is all about. These broader or narrower taxonomic concepts that are going to change in the concept that's being assessed for the Red List. So on that note, I'll now hand over to Janet to...
Thanks, Craig. Yeah. Good to share my screen now. So Craig's now taken you through some of the key points on the Taxon homepage. This goes by different names. I normally call it Taxon homepage. Some people call it species page. I'm now going to take you through some of the parts within the assessment itself for when you're entering your data. I'm not going to go through everything. As I'm sure most of you are well aware, there's an awful lot of fields in SIS, and you don't need me to tell you what goes in every single one. but I am going to take you through some of the key points and some of the more recent functionality that you may or may not be aware of yet. So I've started where Craig left off on the Taxon homepage for this species, and you'll see that there are assessments in 2 different places here. If you have gone in through a working set, then in this top right section, you'll see the assessments which are part of that working set scope. Down here in this box, you will see all of the assessments of that species. In this case, there's only one assessment, so you only see the same assessments in each case. But for most of you, you'll be working in working sets set to draft scope, so you'll only see the draft assessment up here, and you'll see all of its previous published ones as well as the draft down here. So to make sure that you're going into the right assessment as per your working set, it's best to click into it up here. Now, lots of the fields in SIS are text narrative fields. There's also several other kinds of fields. But in the text narrative fields, that's where you're providing some narrative information on each of the relevant topics. There are format buttons, and that's where you can italicize your etal and anything else as per relevant. But one of the really common things that we see is people having pasted this in from a PDF or some other similar place that has taken formatting with it. So here you'll see that this text looks just fine as it is, but here in the top right, we've now got a button to see the HTML source of it. And if you click that, you'll see that something odd has happened as this has been copied in. We've got some HTML coding which shouldn't be there. If this remains as it is and gets carried across to the website like that, then that may affect how it's displayed on the Red List website. You might end up with a big gap before the text starts or some other strange formatting on the screen. So when pasting into SIS, we recommend that you always go via a plain text editor, such as Notepad, because that will strip out any HTML coding. So copy into Notepad and then copy from Notepad into SIS if you're going to be doing any copy pasting. And or when you're in the text field, click on the HTML button to see what the actual underlying data is, and that will allow you to remove this coding. And then you can toggle it back off again to check that it now still displays correctly. There are various other text boxes in SIS, justification boxes attached to various data parameter fields. Here, somebody has written, it has been collected from 2 cave systems which are affected separately by threats. That's a good explanation for the number of locations. That's great detail to have there. But it's important to note that these fields don't get published to the Red List website. Any of these justification fields, which don't have the text editing buttons associated with them, don't get carried across. So this useful information about how the locations has been calculated, that would be better to also include somewhere else in the assessment. It might be that they've included it in the rationale, in which case that's fine, but try to make sure that you're thinking through when you're entering your data, whether there's anything in these justification boxes which is really pertinent to the assessment that isn't mentioned elsewhere, and try to include it in the relevant place. There's also the parameter fields for things like AOO, EOO, number of locations. And these, we very frequently see a single number entered in the box, which we assume is your best estimate of that field. But SIS allows you, and we really encourage you, to enter these as a range. So here we've got an AOO entered as 8 to 40. That's entered simply as 8-40. And that means that your estimate is that the ARO is somewhere between 8 and 40. That's great. That's the Standards and Petitions Committee are really encouraging better use of uncertainty in red list assessments. It's actually very rare that you're going to know for certain what the area of occupancy, the extent of occurrence, the population size are. And putting some bounds on a range is far better than using a number, which may not be accurate. You can even go a step further and put your best estimate in by entering a comma, and then if you think that it's probably at the upper end, then you might put 40. If you think it's at the lower end, but it might not be 8, you can even have a range for the lower end. So you could have 8 to 40, comma, 8 to 12. And that means that you estimate it's between 8 and 40, but it's most likely to be between 8 and 12. And that's the same for any of these numerical data fields. You can enter a range and you can put a best estimate after the range as well. Another function which not all of you will have access to, as SIS is permissions-based, but some of you will have access to, is the batch change function. And this allows you to change all of the assessments in a working set at the same time. So I'm just going to go to a different species here. If I wanted to change all of these assessments to have the biogeographic realm in the Arctic, then I would be able to do that using the cog and the batch change function. And you'll see that there's 3 options that appear there. To overwrite it, which means that every assessment in that working set will then have Nearctic entered as the only biogeographic realm to replace anything which is already there. Or you can overwrite only if blank, which means that if there are no biogeographic realms there, then Nearctic will be the one which carries over. Or you can use that to remove biogeographic realm information from any assessment in your working set. Again, SIS is permissions-based, so not all of you will have these functions, but if you're managing assessment projects, you may be able to do this, and that can really save you some time in entering information which is the same throughout all assessments in your working set, but do be careful with it and make sure you're only using it in situations where you really do want to batch change it throughout. You'll see that sometime, if it's blank, if you haven't got anything selected, you won't be able to batch change. And if you tick, you won't immediately be able to batch change. That's because it needs to have saved in SIS before the batch change becomes available. So if you want to do a batch change from blank, then tick what you want, click save, and then the batch change options will appear. Going to go back to the initial species I was on now and have a look at references. We spend quite a lot of time in the Red List unit correcting references which have been entered incorrectly. So it's really helpful to us if you can make sure that they're properly entered to start with. It allows us to spend less time processing assessments, and that means that in each Red List update, we will get through more assessments. There's always assessments that take longer than we hope to process and end up getting carried forwards to the next time. And if the references are correctly entered, that really speeds up our job. So, as I'm sure most of you know, you manage references through the Tools menu or through the References menu. There are options to view them, which simply gives you a list of what's attached, or to manage them in more detail. This is an incomplete assessment. It's only got some of the fields complete and it's only got one reference attached to it. And at first glance, this reference looks just fine. It's displayed correctly. in the view references function, and it looks like it displays fine here. But if I actually click on it to edit it, I'll see that this reference has not been entered correctly. Although all of the information is there, it has been entered all on the author line. All of the information on that of this reference, which should be in the appropriate fields, has all been put on one line. And that will actually mean that some of the formatting doesn't turn out quite right, even though at first glance it looks okay. So when you're entering a reference, make sure that you are putting the right parts of the data in the right fields, and make sure that it's the right kind of reference. The default is journal type. So the default reference type is journal article. But if you're entering a book, then you need to select it appropriately. Electronic source, likewise. I'm not going to go through now and put all of this into the right fields, but obviously the year should go down there, the title should go down there, etc. In electronic source as an option, you'll see that there's these two options of access year and access date. And sometimes we will see something like this. Someone has put in 16th of November 2022. It's actually only the access date which gets carried across into the citation. So what we need you to put in access date is 16th of November 2022, because that's the field which gets incorporated into the way the reference is displayed. Even though this appears that you're duplicating information, when you actually look at how the citation turns out, that's what we need. We need the full date written out in full in access date. Now, of course, you also may wish to attach new references. Whenever you want to add a reference to your assessment, please, as a first step, check whether or not it's already in the system. We end up with lots of duplicate references being entered because people haven't found a previous version of that reference that's already in the system. So if I were to want to look for Eschmaer's catalogue of fishes, which is not relevant to this particular species, but if I were, then you'll see there's lots of versions of Eschmaer's reference already in. We can in fact find the ones from this year. Catalogue of fishes is updated several times per year, so it may well be appropriate that there's lots of these versions of 2022. They all have different dates of access, and you'd want to select the most recent one or enter a new version if the most recent access date isn't recent enough to reflect what you're trying to show. But don't just enter a new reference without first checking whether or not the reference that you want to use is indeed already in the system.
Janet, just a little pause. Seth Ratcliffe has asked, is the ability to edit references permissions-based? I do not have the option to edit references once it is in the system. Yes. A bug on this. Could you explain, please?
Yes. So there is an option here to edit or view the selected reference, which you'll see the details. If this reference is already attached to existing published assessments, then practically nobody, apart from the Red List Unit, will be able to edit that reference because it's already attached to other assessments. If you were to edit that reference, then that would then affect all of the assessments which it's attached to. And if that's a correction of the formatting, that might be a perfectly valid thing for you to want. But we have had instances of people editing, say, a GBIF reference to reflect that of a particular species, and then saving it, attaching it to all of the existing assessments using that reference, which will now show as a particular species in GBIF when they may have been trying to reference GBIF as a whole. And that is a major problem. So that has recently been disabled to not allow anybody to edit a reference which is already attached to existing assessments. If there's a mistake in the reference and you want it to be edited to correct the mistake, to correct the formatting, to correct an author's name, then please email us in the Red List Unit and we'll be able to correct that. If it's that you want to make a new version of an assessment, perhaps reference that particular species in GBIF specifically, then please enter it new, and then it won't be attachable to any of the existing assessments using it.
Thanks, Janet.
Also, with your references and with your in-text citations, please do check the documentation standards and consistency checks document, which is available on the Red List website, also known as the supporting information guidelines. That will explain how we would like references to be formatted, including the fact that etal should be italicized, that there should be commas between each reference in a string of references, unless you have multiple references of the same author, in which case you use a comma between those and semicolons between those of other authors, and various other edge cases and examples, which we won't go through in detail, but please do check the supporting information guidelines to make sure that you're entering your references correctly to start with, and then we don't need to duplicate work by going through them and correcting them when they come to us for checking. Okay, I'm now going to hand back to Craig for some details on the classification schemes. Craig, you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Good. Okay, so thanks, Janet. We're now back on the Taxon homepage again, the Heliconia example I showed you earlier. So now what we're going to look at is some common issues that we find when people are filling in the classification schemes. So let me go into the draft assessment for the species. And where I'm going to start is with the countries of occurrence. So what often happens, people are adding the countries of occurrence. They will go in, they will select the quick add function and then just go through the list here and add whatever unit they think appropriate to record the distribution of that species. So in this case, they've recorded it as Ecuador mainland, and it all looks, that's fine. Yes, not a problem. It should be okay to submit like that, but it isn't. This entry here is just for Ecuador mainland. It doesn't say Ecuador itself, even though there's Ecuador there in the string. Ecuador, if we push this to the website, this species would not appear in a search for Ecuador because it won't have the Ecuador record added. So always make sure that you have country and any sub-country units added. So we are in fact looking into disabling this quick add function so that people don't make that mistake. And we also have cases where people will add all the units and then untick the countries because they think they're already there because the sub-country units are indicated. So they're deliberately removing the countries from the codings. And so we're also trying to look at how we might disable that. If you do have a case like that, we've done that. Just say add countries, save, and now Ecuador is now added. But as soon as you do that, of course, the attributes are missing. So you have to remember to go in and make sure that everything is ticked. When you're adding the countries and sub-countries of occurrence, there's this one option here called formally bred. This is essentially a field that was added for our colleagues at BirdLife for recording bird ranges where they are interested in where birds have bred and haven't bred. We're finding a lot of people are filling this in and entering in yes when it's completely inappropriate to have entered yes. So in most cases, please just ignore formerly bred. We're interested in presence, origin, and is it resident or not. Some of the other information might be important for migratory species. If your species isn't migratory, just have it ticked as resident. Done. And now we have country and the subcountry unit, and the codings align with each other. So that's on the countries of occurrence. Another issue that happens is if your species is listed as extinct, we often find that people will, when they, oops, sorry, the wrong one there. I'll stay on there. So if your species is listed here as extinct, so completely gone, last seen in 2003, that extinction should also be reflected in your coding for the countries of occurrence. So the country and all the subcountry units should all be coded as extinct. We often find that people list something as extinct, but they leave this occurrence coding as extant. So that's clearly an error. And at the same time, you should be checking your range map and making sure that what you're coding in terms of presence on your range map is also aligned with what's in SIS. So in this case, the range map should also be extinct. And if you look at the Chinese cuttlefish on the website, sure enough, it has all been coded as extinct. That whole red range is extinct. Right, if we go back to our Heliconia again, moving to a different classification scheme. Let's look at the threats, because this is often where threats are coded. So what happens, people will code up threats here and have long lists of different threats that are coded. But when you look at the text, it might be blank, or it might only talk about one or two of those threats, not everything that is listed here. What is coded here should always be reflected in the text, in the narrative. So be sure that the two things align. So here you should really be coding the threats that are driving the status of the species. What is causing the species to be vulnerable? Not just every single threat that could possibly be affecting the species. If you are wanting to record every single threat, then you need to make sure that you fill in the scope and the severity of every threat to show that many of those threats might only be affecting a tiny part of the range, and so will only be having a very minor impact, if at all, or even no impact in some cases. So just be careful when you're coding the threats that you code them correctly. Now, in this case, Heliconia is a herbaceous plant. So the threat that's been coded here is logging, intentional logging. You can't log a herbaceous plant, so something's wrong there. So in fact, what they've done here is it's not intentional logging, because you can't log the species itself. They've chosen the wrong option. So what they should really have done is gone into, in the logging options, you've got intentional and you've got unintentional. So what they really meant in this case was it was unintentional, actually large scale, unintentional large scale harvesting. So the timber company going in because it's forestry concession and harvesting the trees in that area could impact this species which is growing in the understory. So that is really what you should be recording, not that one. And once again, you change your timing because it's a future threat. So proposed listing for the species is vulnerable D2. So that is the future threat that could affect the species if that logging concession goes ahead. So just be careful of using intentional and unintentional in coding of threats. That's a very, very common area that we find across many, many assessments. Just going to a different plant species. Sorry, I got out of the system there by mistake. So if we go to a species of palm, Pichadia gordoni, which is endemic to Hawaii. Another thing we find with coding of threats, the text will talk about lots of species being affected by non-native plant species and various other named invasives, feral pigs, rats, and so on. But in the coded threats, they will often just have 8.1.1 unspecified species. It's really helpful to have all the named invasives listed there if possible, because we link from the Red List database to the Global Invasive Species database, and they link back to us as well. So there's a cross-flow of information about invasive species management and the species that are affected. So if the species are not named here, that breaks the connection across to the Global Invasive Species database. So to add named invasives, you have to use the quick add function. In this case, you go onto whatever the relevant invasive is. Could be 8.1.2, or if it's a native species, it could be 8.2.2. It could be a disease, so it could be 8.5.2. So you would select that, and then you can then add your taxa over here. You search for it. If your named invasive is not in the SIS backbone, let us know, email the Red List unit, and we will then add it to the system so that you can then attach it as a named invasive. But most invasives, all the invasives that are in the Global Invasive Species database are in the system, so they should be easy enough to add and then record them as named invasives. The one set of invasives or problem species that are not in the backbone are diseases. So these are viruses that are causing diseases. So they're in a completely separate system, and if you want to record a named virus, let us know if it's not in the system. So I'll just go to, say we get to add that, you can add the virus, you'll see a list of all the potential viruses that come up. 50 different types of virus. You then just tick whichever ones are appropriate. You can then add those. Obviously, none of these are all animal viruses, not plant viruses, so it wouldn't be relevant for a plant in this case. But if you have any named viral diseases, if you'd like added to the system, please let us know. We will add them for you. The other area, let's go back to our, is about trade and use. So if a species is used, and this is very much about human use of a species for food, medicine, materials, for chopping down and feeding to their livestock, and so on, that is captured in the trade and use section. If a species is eaten, if the fruits of a plant are eaten by other species, that is not use. That is just natural ecology, and that should be recorded in the ecology section if you want to capture that. The use is very much about human use of the species for different purposes. If the species is not known to be used, you tick the box up here, not utilized. If you think it might be used, but you don't have information or details about it being used, or it's related to a species that is used, but you don't know if this particular one is used, you might tick that box up there. Let's just show you another example of the use. So in this case, the Chinese paddlefish, the main cause for driving the species extinct was actual use of the species. If you look at the threats, you can see there was both intentional fishing of all the species and unintentional. So in this case, both those codes are correct, because it gets caught as bycatch, but it was also specifically targeted by fishermen, because it's an important species for eating. So in the use section, there's a story there about the use, but it's ticked as not utilized. That in fact should have been not ticked, because it was used in the past, and the information about that use should have been captured down here. So that was a mistake in that assessment. Another kind of use, which people don't think about, is what we call non-consumptive use, where species get used for other purposes, but not to be consumed by people. So an example of that is whale sharks. If we look at the use narrative, a whole long story here about how whale sharks are used around the world, but in the end section there's a discussion about tourism and how whale shark tourism is generating huge amounts of revenue. So in those cases, if you click over one tab under the use and trade section, there's a section called non-consumptive use. You would tick that box and explain that there's tourism around that consumptive use, but the more detailed information is in trade and use narrative. So just be aware that non-consumptive option is often forgotten about. In using the classification schemes, you might not know what all the different terms and what the definitions of everything are. If you go to the resources and publications page on the Red List website and scroll down to the guidelines section, you'll see all the different classification sections. You click on classification schemes. Each one is a summary page and is a detailed sheet with examples and guidance on how to apply that scheme. Some of these schemes are under review at the moment. So, for example, the threats scheme is under review, and there is another webinar that's going to be taking place looking at what threats might be missing, what should be changed to the system. And this is part of a joint process to update and review our threats classification scheme, plus the conservation action scheme. And we're also looking at how we apply threats more consistently across assessments in the future. So we're looking at better evidence for threats. So that's a whole new process that will be coming. But just bear in mind, all these classification schemes do change periodically, and the guidance might change in addition. So just check back here to see if any of the guidance notes have changed. So I will now hand back to Janet to talk about other common issues that we find with assessments.
Thanks, Craig. I'll just share my screen again. Okay, this is going to be a slightly eclectic collection of errors that we quite frequently encounter. I'm going to start with vulnerable D2. Now, any experienced Red List assessor will be able to tell you that you should only use vulnerable D2 in cases where the range is restricted in terms of number of locations or area of occupancy or both, and there is a plausible future threat which could rapidly drive the species to critically endangered or extinct. This is recorded in assessments in the very restricted box in the distribution section. You should only tick yes to this very restricted in area of occupancy and or number of locations if there is also that plausible future threat which could rapidly drive the species to CR or extinct. And this is reflected in this note here, which is big and bold and surprisingly easy to overlook. So please make sure that you only set that to yes if there is a plausible future threat, and mention that threat in the justification or in the threat section or in the rationale or all of the above. But simply writing 2 cave systems, which are 2 separate locations, has only justified that number of locations. We've already got that information reflected in the number of locations box. That should also say, and this species could rapidly be driven to critically endangered by pollution or something like that. You'll see that by ticking this to yes, that will also automatically trigger vulnerable D2 in terms of the criterion calculator. Here we have calculated category and criteria vulnerable D2. If I had not set that to yes, then that would not be showing there. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may also have spotted another mistake or area for concern here. Here we've got a criteria calculator, which is showing vulnerable D2, and we've got an assessment of endangered. And as we've just explored, vulnerable D2 might not even be appropriate in this case anyway. But if we have a look down to the Red List assessment, we can see what's going on here. So here we've got a rationale which explains an assessment of endangered due to its small AOO, EOO, number of locations and continuing decline. And in red list status, again, we've got endangered selected and the relevant box is ticked. So why does the criteria calculator think that this is only vulnerable D2? It must mean that some piece of this information is not correctly reflected in the data fields in the assessment. Somewhere we're missing something that would trigger it to be endangered. For this reason, we recommend that you use the calculator, apart from in cases where you need to override the calculator, which you may need to do, particularly for cases where you might have a range and the criteria calculator has selected the lowest end for population for AOO, and you might think that somewhere on the higher end of the range is more likely. Also for least concern, for near threatened, for extinct, you need to do it manually. But for the threatened categories, we recommend using the criteria calculator in its automatic mode, because that will make sure that all of that information is reflected in the right place in the assessment. So again, we had something missing to trigger endangered. What was it? We've got an EOO and an AOO entered, which are within the bounds. We've got a number of locations, but has the assessor entered a continuing decline? They'd said there was continuing decline in habitat quality. Turns out it hasn't been entered. So we can make sure that that's set to yes there. We can make sure that there's the relevant supporting information, justification about that somewhere in the text. And now we'll see that the automatic calculator is correctly reflecting the intended assessment, which matches that written in the rationale. So that's a really good thing to make sure that you get into the habit of checking. Does your assigned assessment match the one which the calculator is providing? Again, there might be instances where it doesn't for a very good reason, but in the vast majority of cases for threatened species, these two should be in agreement, as should the rationale. Another error that we sometimes see is people not correctly thinking through the data quality types. In each of these drop-downs, you'll see the qualification for observed, projected, inferred, estimated in this case. Suspected is the final data quality type. But not all data quality types are acceptable for all parameters. So if you were to say that there is a continuing decline in mature individuals and that this is based on habitat loss, say, then that would actually be a suspected continuing decline. If we're using habitat loss to say something about the number of mature individuals, that's a change in different data quality types, so that ought to be a suspected decline in continuing mature individuals. And that isn't an option here. You cannot have a suspected continuing decline. So sometimes people will go, oh, well, suspected isn't there, I guess I'll just put estimated in. That, of course, is incorrect. Estimated has a precise definition. And if you do not have an inferred or higher continuing decline, then you should not be selecting yes for this box. There is also the current population trend box, which should be completed in all assessments apart from those for an extinct species. The options are increasing, decreasing, stable, or unknown. People get a little bit confused as what this really means. Is that the same as continuing decline in mature individuals? What timescale are we talking about here? Now, the current population trend should reflect the situation of around about 3 years around the present. That's found in the supporting information guidelines that you should be thinking on about a 3-year period. So during the current 3 years, do you think the population is increasing, decreasing, stable, or unknown? It could be that there is a continuing decline happening in a sort of stop and start bumpy way, and that at the moment it's stable, but that's part of an ongoing continuing decline, in which case stable would be appropriate to select here. And as long as the data quality were correct, you could still select that there is a continuing decline over here. And you'll see that for all of these drop downs on data fields, there'll be a data quality to select along with that. And it's important to reflect that accurately and make sure that you're remembering the definitions whenever you're using it. One thing that we don't encounter all that often, but it's still worth pointing out, is people misunderstanding this reviewed tick box. This refers to the review by the Red List Authority. It does not refer to the review by the Red List Unit. We've got a separate section which we complete when we've checked the assessment. But before submitting an assessment to the Red List Unit, when it's done its internal review by the Red List Authority or other relevant experts, that's when that box should be ticked and the date completed. The submissions function in SIS won't let you submit an assessment until that is correctly completed, ticked and filled in. But sometimes we get people emailing us saying, why can't I submit this assessment? All that I'm missing is the review and you guys are doing that. So again, that's for when its internal review has happened, and all assessments should have been reviewed. All assessments from within the SSC network should have already been reviewed before they reach us in the Red List Unit. We don't call our process the review, we call that the consistency check, or we sometimes more broadly refer to it as processing assessments. I'm not going to show you how to add assessors reviewers in detail. I'm sure you're all aware that you do that through the managed credits section here. I see somebody raised their hand. Was there a question? Frank, if you could type your question in the Q&A, then we'll be able to address it. Meanwhile, I will move on to reasons for change. This is another section which often gets missed out when it should be filled in or filled in inappropriately. The reason for change section is to reflect the change, any change which has happened since the previous published assessment. So here we have a species which is being assessed for the first time. That means that this non-genuine change that somebody has entered, new information, second site discovered since the assessment was first drafted, that's not what we're trying to record here. This appears to be somebody trying to reflect that maybe in a workshop this assessment has been drafted as one thing, and then later in the review process the assessment has changed due to new information. But this section is for changes since the previous assessment. So if it's the first time assessment, this should be blank. The whole section should not be filled in. If there had been a previous assessment, then if the category and criteria are exactly the same as the previous time, then you would select no change, same category and criteria. If the category is the same but the criteria have changed, then it's the second option here. And for genuine and non-genuine changes, that's for when the situation has genuinely improved or deteriorated from the species versus whether there's new information, change in the understanding of the application of the criteria. Maybe it was last assessed in 1998 and the criteria themselves have changed since then. Those are all kinds of non-genuine change, which you can tick there. Okay, lots of these errors or incorrect ways of entering information can be pulled up by SIS's consistency checker. If you're somebody who is submitting assessments, you will already be familiar with this, because when assessments are submitted to us in the Red List unit, they automatically go through the consistency checker, the integrity checker that's built into SIS before they enter the submissions queue. But even if you're not submitting assessments right now or at all, you can access this integrity checker to see what might be missing from your assessment. That's found in the tools section. You can select validate assessment. And if it's the first time that you're doing this in a session, then you'll have to log in again. The system will run through a series of checks, which for one species is usually quite quick, will take less than a minute. If it's taking a long time, it usually indicates that there's something wrong. When it's complete, you can view it, you can download it as a CSV. If you're running this on a whole working set or a few species, then it can be really useful, or you're getting lots of errors, it can be really useful to download that and then filter it to check for your failures, for your warnings. But if you're just looking at one species, it might be quicker just to look at it here. Here we'll see in the results section, most things are just fine in this assessment. Most things are coming out as passed. We're not going to look at all of these in detail. All we're going to look at is the fact that there is one warning. A warning will not prevent you submitting the assessment, but that doesn't mean you can just ignore it. A warning will often be something which you want to address before you submit the assessment, a piece of information that may be missing, incomplete. Here, though, our warning data deficient reason is missing. This is the one warning to really think about whether or not it actually is a problem. If the DD assessment is based on taxonomy or unknown provenance, DD reason is required. If the DD assessment is based on insufficient information, DD reason is not required. Please check this before submitting the assessment. We've recently changed the way that that message displays to make it clearer, because in the majority of DD cases where it's simply insufficient information, then you shouldn't be ticking the provenance or taxonomy. Those are very specific cases which are outlined in the guidelines on what counts as provenance, what counts as taxonomy in terms of DD. So if this species is simply DD due to insufficient information, in this case, it's been collected very rarely, but there don't seem to be any taxonomic problems. The collecting sites are known. Then straight DD without either of those ticked is correct. And that is the case for most DD assessments. So that warning coming up saying, think about DD, check it with yourself. Probably most of the time it is correct that you don't have either of those ticked. Likewise, if you do tick either of those, make sure that that is based on either provenance, that being we don't know where it's from at all, or taxonomic uncertainties being the cause of insufficient data. Those are very specific special cases, so only use those then. Does anybody have any questions on that? Caroline, was there anything in the chat?
There have been quite a few questions as we've been going along, and I've been answering them. One thing I would like to highlight about this page, because someone did ask this question during the registration phase, is we can see on this screen the question, is the reassessment subject to the 5-year rule? Now, earlier on, I highlighted that we're not going to talk about criteria or any of the rules and parameters. So I just want to say that you can find out all the information you need about the 5-year rule in the Red List guidelines. So it's in the section about changing category. One other question has come in. Can you demonstrate entering manual data? So I think this is referring to the criteria calculator versus the manually entered category and criteria.
Yes, of course. So here I have a very blank assessment. Let's say this is the least concerned species, and pretends that there's information throughout with perhaps very large values in AOO and EOO, or more likely those not completed at all. At that stage, if you go for enter manual data, for the drop down, you can select which category it should be, and then reflect in the assessment rationale why it's least concern. Something like, this is a widespread species with no significant threats. The criteria calculator, if there aren't sufficient of the data fields completed, will often say not yet calculated, or will perhaps say DD when realistically you know that this is a least concern species. So that's the case when you can do that. Or if we go down to this one again, let's say that we don't have an extent of occurrence here. This is not necessarily a particularly realistic example, but just for the sake of demonstrating. If we've got an AOO of 8 to 40 and one location only this time, then as long as there's continuing decline, then the criteria calculator will say critically endangered, because we've got an area of occupancy below 10, one location, continuing decline. If, as the assessor, you know that it's more likely to be on the upper end, then we would recommend that you enter that here as a best range, but you can also override it here, change that back to endangered, tick the boxes as appropriate, and in the assessment rationale, write something along the lines of, although it is plausible that it could qualify for critically endangered based on the lower end of its range of area of occupancy, I think it's more likely that it's higher than 10, and therefore I'm assessing it as endangered rather than as critically endangered. There was actually one further section which I wanted to point out to people in the population section. You'll see that there's this box down here for number of subpopulations. This isn't a box which gets filled out very often, especially for species with which are relatively data poor. It normally only gets filled in for species being assessed under C. But you'll see that if I do enter a number here, then suddenly there is more that has appeared below this on my screen. There's a box to write a justification about that number of subpopulations, again remembering the definition of subpopulation as according to the Red List categories and criteria, and you can put in records here of each individual subpopulation, which subpopulation it is, the number of mature individuals, and the current trend there. We don't have anywhere to record past number of mature individuals for each of these subpopulations. We want the current number, estimated number, if you've got it, and you can mention any previous data in the text. Okay, with that, I think I'll hand back over to Craig.
Thank you, Janet. So now we're going to move out of SIS. I see we are running out of time. So this is just going to be a very short introduction to what we call SIS Connect. So this is another way of getting data into the SIS platform. So the whole reason for creating SIS Connect was because many countries around the world run their own national red list schemes, and lots of those countries have many endemics, and so those endemic assessments done for the national red lists should be on the IUCN Red List, because those are global assessments if they've been done to the correct standards. And many of those countries have their own database systems, and they don't want to sit and manually enter everything into SIS. They would rather just transfer from their database to SIS. So that was the reason for developing SIS Connect, a portal, a platform to act as an interface between their database and our database. You might ask, well, why don't they just do directly importing the data directly into SIS? You can just imagine a large system like SIS bringing in data from an external system could be extremely risky. It could corrupt all of the data in SIS itself. So we have this platform to upload the data initially, to run various checks on it automatically and physically, manually. And then if we're happy with the data, we think it's not going to cause any problems, we can then say, yes, bring it into SIS. So it's just really a very important cautionary step that we have to make sure that what we bring in is secure and safe and is not going to affect what is in SIS, particularly if you're going to overwrite assessments that are already in SIS. So there are different ways of signing into the platform. Everybody who has a SIS account can use SIS Connect can access it using their SIS account. Initially, all they would be able to see would be the export functions, and I'll come back to that in a moment, why we have the export functionality. But just to focus on the import functionality, if you want to import assessments from your database system into SIS, you need to request permissions to do so, and that will then get assigned to your user account. So I'm just going to log into the system. So important is that under information, there's a whole section on help, and it's really important that you show this to the data manager on your side if you have a database system that you are using, because what they need to do is they need to be able to generate an export from your data system that will then match the import format for SIS. And there's lots of information here about, let me just open this in a new tab. So for example, this page has a detailed field by field account, what the field name is called in SIS, what it needs to be called in your file that you upload, what type of field it is, does it use lookup schemes, is it a Boolean data set, what is it? So everything is spelled out. So most database people will be able to look at this and understand what this means, and will then be able to map the fields from their database to create an output that will then match the input fields required for SIS. So once you've generated your output files, you have a set of files. You don't have to do, when you're uploading assessments, they can be just part of the data you want for an assessment. It could just be the taxonomy you want to bring into SIS. It's an easy way of bringing in lots and lots of species that are brand new to SIS. You use SIS Connect to do that. It could be a complete assessment, virtually a complete assessment with all data fields filled in. It's never completely complete because there are certain fields that have to be filled in SIS before assessments can be submitted to us. So you can't upload a complete assessment and just assume that it's your work done. You still need to do work in SIS. Most users won't see all these pages. You'll see just your user working sets that you've uploaded, but these are just examples that have been uploaded to the system recently. And essentially what you're generating, your export from your database, is a series of CSV files. So each CSV file relates to a particular section in SIS. So for example, if I open up this Chanterelle's one that was uploaded yesterday, you can see the whole set of names on the left-hand side here. Each one of those relates to a file name, which contains a set of data fields related to that bit of SIS. So some of those are quite straightforward to understand. Common names, that's where you would have all your common names. In this case, they haven't added those, so that's why it's struck through, because they haven't worried to add the common names at this point. Countries, that's the countries of occurrence, sub-countries of occurrence. Credits, who the assessors were, who the reviewers were, who the contributors were, and so on. Habitats, that's the habitats classification scheme, or the references in the right format in that reference. The taxonomy, that's the important file, because all these other files link to the taxonomy file. Within the taxonomy file, there's a unique ID for each taxon in the taxonomy file. If I open that up, you can see there's an internal ID, and that internal ID is then reflected in, for example, any of the other files. So we then know, we can then match that name to that bit of information in the habitats. So every file is linked through that internal ID. So that's what your export system from your database has to generate, those internal IDs. Against each of these tables, you see the various icons, and it gives you, and if you put your cursor on it, says they're warnings. There might be some issues in there. If it's all green, it's 100% correct. If it's red, poor, means there's some failures, there's some issues there. So when you upload your files, you have your set of CSV files between one, if you're just doing taxonomy, it's one file, or it could be all 16 files if you're covering every possible aspect of the Red List process. They should be zipped together. Each file within the zip file has to be the correct names following the system. It can't be, you can't add anything to these names. It has to just be these names. You upload your zip file, and then once it's uploaded, it runs various checks in the system to see if the data matches up what the system expects. It's looking at data integrity. Is it the right data type that's expected? Are there various issues? And that's, it uses those checks to then generate these different icons against the individual files. You can then open your file once it's in, and you look at it and say, oh, yes, that's all fine. I think it's okay. I can then push that over to the Red List unit, because they can then decide what they want to do with it. So if I go back to the working sets, under actions here, you would then say, well, that case has been assigned to us already. So for example, here, this one, it's failed, but they still think it's fine. They could say, submit to Red List unit. When you click submit to Red List unit, we get an email saying a working set has been uploaded. We can then come and look at it, see, check everything here, go inside, make sure that all the potential errors are not serious errors. And if we're happy that we can import that, we will then say, let's see, the apples passed into us. We would then say accept, Red List unit, accept. Or we might reject it, we might send it back to them. And there are ways in the system of sending messages back and forwards to the assessors, and for them to send messages to us within these individual uploads. So on each, if I open up a table, scroll down to the bottom, the comments. So I can put a comment in there, submit the comment, and that comment will go back to the person who submitted. I can say, yeah, you made some mistakes here, and these need to be corrected. One of the things we want to do in SIS Connect going forwards is that often they're just really minor things. So to correct them, you have to export the data file, fix it, and then re-upload it again. So we are trying to bring in some simple functionality to be able to edit data directly in the system here to fix very minor issues, instead of having to export, re-import to fix those things. So that's a future development that will happen. So that's all I want to say really on that part of it. Let me just log out of there. The other key bit of SIS Connect, which came a bit later, was that we realized that this was also a good tool for getting data out of SIS. Many countries use SIS to do assessments, and then they want to export those assessments to upload to their own website for their own national red list process. So SIS Connect is one way of doing that. So I do a different way of logging in. I'm now looking at the exports function. So these are various exports that I've done, and I create a working, you have a working set in SIS. If I want to bring in a new different working set, I just click on new SIS export. I can then see all my different working sets in SIS. So any of you who have an SIS account, you go into the exports, you can then see all those things. And my screen has gone funny. That what happened there. While to refresh. Anyway, so you can select a working set from SIS and say you want to export that working set. And these are various working sets that I've exported for different people. So reasons for doing exports are that you might want to, you've completed the global reptile assessment, you export all the reptile data through SIS Connect. There's no limitation on size of data sets. And you can then use that to do various analyses of the reptile data for a paper that you're wanting to write. You might want to import data from SIS Connect into your own database system, so you can work on it further within your own process. So you can use SIS Connect to do that, or you can use it to export the data and then upload it to your own website if you're using SIS to manage your national red list assessments. And there are a few institutions that are doing that around the world, like Zambia and South Africa, Colombia, Brazil, and so on, using our system to go back and forwards between their databases and SIS. The other important point is that if you are wanting to reassess a species that is already assessed on the red list and you're using your own database system, what you should do is use the export function first to export the current draft of that assessment into your system. You can then edit it in your own system, and once you've made all the changes, you then re-upload it. So you're building off the current published assessment rather than adding a brand new assessment that doesn't refer back to the published assessment at all. So just bear that in mind. It's a good way of doing reassessments. Export them out, put them into your own system if you have one. Do what you need to do in that because you prefer to use your own system, and then export them back out into SIS again once you've completed that. So it's a very quick whirlwind tour of SIS Connect. There's a lot more we could go into, but just given the amount of time we have left, I think I'll just stop now to see if there are any further questions.
Thank you, Craig. There are no more questions in the Q&A area, so we have 2 minutes left. So I think that's probably a good time to stop. Thanks so much to Craig and Janet for a fantastic presentation, very clear. Hopefully we've clarified some of the areas that we see being misunderstood in SIS, and we've helped you to fill in your data a little bit more effectively. Thank you to Clay Meredith, who's based in Albuquerque, so he's joined us in a very unsociable time of the day and stuck with us all the way through. So thank you for the technical support in getting this webinar up and running, and thank you in general to the New Mexico Biopark Society for making these webinars possible in the first place. Very much appreciated, and thanks to all of you for joining us and for asking fantastic questions. I've been quite busy in the Q&A section. If you have further questions, just contact the Red List Unit. You can contact me directly or any of us directly, or you can contact us via the website. I put links to 2 resources that are relevant to this session into the chat. So there's a link to the SIS self-teach tool, which is quite old, but it's particularly useful for new people getting used to using SIS. We will update it at some point. And there's also a link to the supporting information guidelines, which is another document that is currently being updated at the moment. So watch this space for it to be released. So we will repeat this webinar next week on Wednesday, the 23rd of November at a later time to allow other people from different regions to join. And we'll also get the recording up on the website within the next couple of weeks. Thanks again for joining us. And wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Thank you.